There's all these little Nantucket, the vineyard, all these things have really interesting issues. And Michael's good because he knows about biogeography and some of the history of bees and other things. So it's pretty exciting, actually. I really had a fun time just doing my very shallow look at the literature and whatnot. And it could lead to other things. So for example, if you're going to collect for this bee, you're going to be collecting a whole bunch of other species. So that would be of interest to see what's the community of bees found on chestnuts throughout its range. So we're here because of Andrena renyi, which is a very interesting system. From a plant point of view, from the chestnut point of view, there's, I'm sure, exceptions, but the general rule is plants don't depend on their specialist bees as much as specialist bees depend on their plants. So you wink out the plant, so in this case, Castanea, if they're obligate, as they appear to be, feeders on chestnut, they're all gone, right? But if you wink out all the Andrena renyi, chestnut has hedged its bets, and almost certainly has hedged its bets by being available to lots of other Andrena species. So you would want, in the end, to know both those questions. What is Andrena renyi's distribution? That's a great story, right? It's another reason to be looking at the conservation of that tree species, because it's bringing along another rare endangered plant that would, or creature that would disappear without it, and also learning about what's important to the tree in terms of the community of bees that are not obligates, but are also moving pollen and nectar around. I forgot to mention one really interesting thing about this whole system. I'm sorry I didn't earlier in case people are not around, but if you think about the bloom periods in trees that are insectivorous, chestnut's the last one, at least in the northern parts of Appalachia. So I don't know exactly what's going on with silver bells and all these crazy things down in Great Smokies, but almost everything else is starting in March and then running through May, and then it's over. Like mid-May, the interior of woodlands is absent of bees that we're aware of because there's nothing blooming there anymore. All the understory, the vernal plants, every part of that system on up all the way to the tops of the trees, done. There is nothing going on. But that would not be the case if chestnut were around and part of that system. It would essentially extend the bloom period, and that's probably part of the MO of chestnut, right? Which is I'm in competition for my pollinators. So why would I bloom in the period when everything else is blooming and I'll be competing? I'm going to bloom after. And there is some indications that, for example, chestnut may be a very important source of pollen for bumblebees. So bumblebees are generalists. They have to keep going throughout the year. There's a whole bunch of them that are associated with forests. It could very well be that and I'm talking about all the species of Castanea, are providing this big chunk of pollen and nectar. Remember, trees are big. So trees, if you did the little calculations and how much pollen and nectar versus a bunch of little weedy plants in the understory, it's huge, right? So again, from the bee people point of view, we're probably haven't been thinking enough about the dominance in terms of a pollen nectar load available to bees of tree species because we can't get to them. And so we're just going to look on the ground, and we're just not enough people looking, period, or thinking about it. So chestnut, very unique from this. Another reason to want it back in our systems is not because of the traditional, here's a bunch of turkey food. Turkeys are fine with acorns. They don't need chestnuts. Like we talk about that as an important big game thing, but I'm saying, like, who cares? It's this whole set of insects that would completely disappear if chestnut were not around. And they fit in a much more integrated way, in a more tight way than the usual story of chestnut, nuts, big game. So I think the more interesting and important story is chestnut community of insects, many of which are tightly interwoven with that species or the three species actually, and another whole set that are constantly using the leaves and everything else. Its integration into our our forest. There's a bonus: seeds all over the place that pioneers can pick up, and whoever else. Not as important, I don't think.
So that's it's a whole nother realm of the big system. You know, in doing the work we've done, you know, the chestnut is not sitting there by itself. It was produced in a system with everything else, and
Yeah.
the bees would be no different. Sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for us to notice and collect things while we're out there.
Right, and bring that to the table of why the trust exists and what its mandates might be expanded to include. And I would really think a lot harder about, well, you probably are, but I'm just going to say chinkapins. It's a thing, and you are right there rubbing up against it a lot. I would think that you might want to think a little chinkapin every once in a while.
Yes. So, you know, so many trees, so little time. I think that's kind of where we are with that, you know, especially with the chinkapins and that suffer from the blight, you know, as bad as the American does. So,
right.
Kendra, do we have any other questions for Sam?
Mostly comments on where to find stuff. Jesse wondered what needs Andrina Rennie.
Sorry, I missed that.
What needs Andrina Rennie? Says I gather he's wondering if there is anything that needs that particular bee.
So it needs, probably, as far as we know right now, it needs American chestnut pollen. So when we talk about specialists, it's specializing on the pollen of. So they do these fun kinds of experiments, those crazy scientists, where they'll take a set of bee species, different species, and they will swap the pollen loads between the species. And then they will swap some pollen loads within the species. So if you swap pollen loads within a species, different bees have collected this, and you just say, all right, I'm taking your pollen load and I'm giving to this other part of your species, and I'm taking that and giving it to you. Everyone does fine. You swap it between species, everybody dies. So it just points out how important the pollen is as a food source. And so it basically just needs the pollen. It's nesting in the ground. These are all ground nesters. You know, there's talk about the structural requirements for different bee species and stuff. We know almost nothing about that in detail, but my guess is that it's not that important. They will find a place to nest. So really, it's all about chestnut bloom. Does that make sense? Did I answer that?
I think so. Oh, I think we're good.